These people were set up on the street and they were giving away syringes, clean syringes for free, and they were risking jail. And every time I talk about that, it moves me. Someone went out, risked their freedom, and touched me. And they said, look, we know what you're doing. We're not here to judge you. If you want to stop, we'll talk to you about that. But, we know you need this right now. And here's the syringe. And to me, it was this transformational moment in my life.
That was Dimitri Mugianis, and I'm Henry Winslow. You're listening to Dharma Talk. Dharma Talkers, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the show, where I go deep with yoga teachers and yoga practitioners I admire. This week, my guest is a little bit non-traditional, not just in the context of this show, seeing as he's not a yoga teacher at all, but also in his methods of spreading love and acceptance, which in my opinion is in fact very yogic. This week I talk with Dimitri Mugianis, a recovering opiate addict, spiritual healer, though he hates being called that, and harm reduction activist. But before we go into the conversation, first, please subscribe to Dharma Talk if you haven't done so already. It takes just a minute of your time, and that way you know you're going to get each episode delivered straight to your phone every Thursday. And if you love the show, please leave a rating and review. You can also share the episode with a friend who you think could benefit from it. And if you have the financial means to do so, please consider making a donation to help keep Dharma Talk up and running. You can always make a donation on my website. Just go to henrywins.com/donate and you'll have the options there. As usual, I have a few announcements to share with you. In November, I'm moving out of New York. So for the New York yogis in the audience or anyone passing through in October, I'd love to come see you for the last hurrah. On October 12th and 13th, I'm giving a Rocket Yoga weekend, Rocket 1, 2, and 3 at Pure Yoga West. On October 26th and 27th, I'm doing a workshop on Saturday and Sunday at Living Yoga in Queens, backbending and handstanding. And then November 3rd, I'm doing a handstand training workshop at my home school of Lighthouse Yoga School. After that, maybe we can sync up travel schedules. But for those workshops in New York, head over to henrywins.com/events and sign up there. Yogis, if you are looking for the perfect way to wrap up 2019 and lay a golden foundation for a beautiful 2020 to come, then please join me and my wife, Veronica Lambo, for our 7-day retreat to Bali. We're calling it Divine Connection because that's our vision for this retreat, that you'll be able to take the time to step away from your typical environment, step away from your social conditioning and your responsibilities, and get honed into the divine light within you. And how do we hope to achieve that? Well, every morning is going to begin with noble silence. This is prime time for self-reflection, self-inquiry, and inner work. Also, we will have a group meditation every day and 2 yoga classes, one more rigorous vinyasa class and one more restorative hatha class. We're going to take care of all the food for you. You'll be provided 3 vegan, plant-based, and refined sugar-free meals a day. And we've also got some exciting adventures and excursions lined up, all included. Basically, we have an amazing experience lined up for you, something totally transformative and empowering. You just have to get yourself to Bali, and then we'll take you through the rest. If this sounds appealing, please head over to henrywins.com/Bali, and you can find all the details there. Now, allow me to introduce my guest from this week, Dimitri Mugianis, at Dimitri Mugianis on Instagram. That's DimitryMugianis, is a drug policy activist, Bwiti spiritual healer, poet, and musician. At the depths of his own heroin and cocaine addiction, Dimitri discovered ibogaine, a plant sacrament from Central Africa that allowed him to break his habit without withdrawal symptoms. Now he provides a safe and dogma-free container for others in which to experience psychedelic medicine, emphasizing self-love and acceptance. Dimitri is currently Nganga in residence at the New York Harm Reduction Educators, NYRE, a service-based community working with addicted, homeless, formerly incarcerated, and HIV-positive people in East Harlem and the Bronx. Dimitri and I have had the pleasure of getting to know one another over the past couple months since I started volunteering at the NYRE. But this conversation really let us go deep, and I'm so happy that I get to share it with you. Some of the topics that we covered over the course of this conversation were his long-term relationship with heroin and cocaine, and the introduction of ibogaine, the plant teacher or sacrament that gave him a new lease on life and revealed to him his own future through visions, which would of course include becoming initiated into the Bwiti faith and bringing the medicine to the U.S. on a mission to detox others suffering just as he had. We also talk about harm reduction, which is a specific term relating to meeting people where they're at without judgment or without attempting to change their habits, and where even progressive policy fails to address the heart. Finally, we talk about psychedelic disintegration and where we should actively choose to dismantle a society that's broken rather than try to integrate or fit in. If this conversation resonates with you and you'd like to learn more about what Dimitri is up to and how you can help out with NYRE or any of the other things that he's got going on, head over to dharmatalk.show and type Dimitri in the search bar, Dimitri, and you'll find all the notes and links for this episode, including timestamps for specific points in the conversation so you can follow along. And by the way, did you know that I've got a running list of every book ever recommended on Dharma Talk? So if you are looking for your next read, head over to henrywins.com/books and pick one out. Now, without further ado, please enjoy this deep and inspiring interview with Dimitri Mugianis. Dimitri, welcome to the show. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be talking with you over the airwaves.
Me too. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity.
Of course. And I owe my gratitude to Rose Aaron Vaughn, who was a previous guest of the show and a close friend of mine, for making the introduction. We've had the pleasure of meeting in person a few times, but I think that we can go pretty deep with this conversation today.
Right on. Yeah. I'm always grateful for Rose in my life. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and for this introduction. Yeah.
Well, the first question that I ask all of my guests is the same. So I'm going to ask you that question first. What does the word Dharma mean to you? And what is your Dharma as you understand it today?
So I think I know what Dharma means, but I'm not sure. So I'll just say this. Dharma, from my understanding, is the Buddhist teachings. So what I understand about that it is probably pretty little in terms of the history and what is actually in the Dharma, other than sort of a cursory, outsiders, sort of outside of yogic or Buddhist practice. But what I understand Dharma to be is the truth. Dharma is a path, a guiding, a light. And maybe we could interpret the Dharma to mean higher self. So my Dharma is to do less, well, to do no harm, but really to do less harm. And actually my spiritual practice is to be a little bit less of an asshole every day. And
that's a good practice.
It's a hard one because sometimes you meet somebody else, and then it's easy by myself in my apartment. The second I walk outside, that's when I have to put it into practice. But yeah, that's it. And yeah, that's pretty much all I know. Can I ask you that question?
Well, I'm glad that you answered the way that you did, because most of the guests that I have on this show come from more of a yoga and Vedic philosophy background, I suppose. But Dharma has kind of a different meaning depending on which teachings you're following. And a lot of people answer more along the lines of how Dharma is defined in the Bhagavad Gita, which has to do with your duty or your path. But the Buddha's teachings, you're right, are also called the Dharma. And it's interesting how when you start to explain yourself and go deeper into unpacking that word, they kind of end up in the same place, which is truth. Yeah, I do think it's truth. And our higher self is the truth after all.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't realize that Dharma was also used in Hindu tradition. So that makes sense though, right? Because that's where the Buddha came from. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Right. Well, There's so many things that I want to talk about with you today. But I figured a nice jumping off point would be the phrase, "I'm dangerous with love." What does that mean? What is the significance of that phrase to you? And maybe take us through a story.
Okay, absolutely. Well, once upon a time, once upon a time, I was a heroin addict. I had a 20-year relationship with heroin. And I call it a relationship because that's what it was. I mean, there was good and bad. There was ups and downs. And I have to say that when I hear someone who's been in a 20-year relationship speaking badly about their ex-partner, it doesn't reflect well on them. So I don't want to speak badly about heroin or cocaine. They were my first plant teachers, for those of you who are familiar with the concept of plant teacher. It's just that, it's more used in the sort of psychedelic plant medicine world. But I learned a lot in that relationship. It also took a lot, I think. I know it took a lot. It gives a lot, heroin and cocaine. It was a numbing of pain. It was a way to get out of the pain of my childhood and youth. But I started out as a young person interested in art and culture and revolution and different ways of experiencing the world, and sort of as a way to numb the pain, anesthetize myself, but also as a way to sort of, in a creative way, at least initially, to say fuck you to the existing oppression of our, modern world. I found myself the ultimate consumer. My whole life was revolved around getting and receiving, trying to get the dope, heroin in this case, and cocaine. And I ended up, my world went very small, but it took a long time. So it was a 20-year process. I was using drugs since a young person. Then I got involved with heroin and injecting heroin and cocaine. And that was 20 years. And, my world became very small. I ended up, after the death of my common law wife, who was pregnant with my baby, sort of in a real dark place. I moved back in with my parents in Detroit, living in the basement after having sort of an expansive life as an artist and an activist in New York City, a musician, and ended up in a really small place where I was just shooting dope, cocaine and heroin. The heroin would give me comfort, and the cocaine would make me psychotic, and I couldn't get out of that cycle. And it's a last ditch sort of attempt, not really to live, but I'm Greek American. I just wanted to go to Greece. I wanted to go to the place of my ancestors, and I didn't really realize the significance of the ancestors at that time. I just wanted to go there. I had a hunger for it, but I couldn't go because of my addiction. I decided to try something that I learned about through the work of Dana Beal and Howard Lutzoff, two pioneers in plant medicine. I heard about in the early 90s something called ibogaine, iboga, which is a plant from Central Africa, from Gabon, equatorial Central Africa. And this plant, the root bark of it, is ingested as an initiatory tool. Much like, I'm sure people are at this point are pretty much familiar with ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms or peyote. It's used as a initiatory sacrament And much like those drugs or plants, however you want to call it, there was a tradition of healing, a cultural tradition and a healing tradition that grew up around the ingestion of the sacrament. And with that, the thing that grew up, there was also an understanding of the pharmacopoeia, in this case of the forest, but with peyote, the desert, or depending on where these medicines are from. So this thing was called Bwiti, this religion or spirituality, but I wouldn't know about that for years. Anyways, I decided as a latch let me back up for a second. One of its properties is that it interrupts physical dependence on opioids and opiates without withdrawal.
And did you know this going into it? Was that what drew you toward it?
Absolutely. Okay. There's no heroin addict that wants to trip.
Okay.
As my friend, the late great Rene Ricard, the poet and painter, said when he heard about ibogaine, and he was an opiate addict. He said, "I want to keep the doors of my perception tightly closed." So the idea wasn't for expansiveness; it was just to be in this cocoon. So the reason I went to this, because I wanted to do this process, and then I wanted to go to Greece and then just come back and continue to die, because that was the first thought in the morning, and my last thought at night was that I wanted to die while I was in the grips of cocaine and heroin. But the Bwiti or God or Dharma had a different plan. I should say that this is one of the most high threshold plant medicines, meaning that it takes a long time. Instead of 3 to 5 hours, like maybe ayahuasca, it's more like the trip is more like 12 to 18 hours, and you might be on your ass for 3 to 4 days, if longer, especially when it's a detox. Mm-hmm. And it's also really difficult. There's also could be cardio complications. It's a high threshold medicine. So it's just no joke. You have to get an EKG before you take it. So I went to Holland. I ended up going to Holland to do this, with the intention of just doing it, going to Greece, coming back and continue to die. I just wanted to touch the ground in Greece. But what happened was, in the course of those 3 days that I was under the medicine, because as an addict, you have to continually take more and more of it to sort of push the withdrawal away. Well, first of all, I didn't experience withdrawal. It was incredibly uncomfortable. It was incredibly difficult journey. But I didn't crave heroin. And in the process of that, so first of all, let me say this. It's not the visions that are doing that, because if you give someone, for example, LSD or psilocybin or any of the psychedelics that you can think of, or plant medicines, who is in withdrawal, is a heroin user, heroin addict, they're just going to trip and be very angry at you because they'll be in withdrawal the whole time. In the initial sort of test dose, a sort of sub-psychedelic dose that is given to someone coming in for a detox, the withdrawals go away. Now, the problem is you have to, well, I don't know if it's a problem, it could be a problem for some people, but you have to give a massive dose to sort of flood people, to pass them over, through their addiction over a day and a half period, let's say. But that worked. The experience itself with Iboga is incredibly difficult. It kicks your ass. You vomit, you sweat, the visions are powerful, but I never was craving heroin. And I had detoxed maybe 30, 40 times. So I went through that process and then spent 10 days recuperating actually I went to Holland, just outside of Amsterdam. So I went to Amsterdam to get clean, which is kind of, amazing in itself, especially in those, it was like Mecca, like for dope users, for a fucking dope fiend like myself. I was like, Amsterdam. Of course, my brother came with me because, I also had like $2,000 in cash. It was probably not a good idea to send me alone to Amsterdam, but, because, it's might have made it. But I had no desire to use. And let me say this is I'm in the minority in that case, because most people go back to using after Iboga. But I had never had a strong desire to use. I have never used heroin or cocaine since that day, 17 years ago. And the phrase, in answer to your question, what does "I'm dangerous with love" mean? I'm a songwriter, a poet, a writer. And I hadn't written anything in many years. The last maybe 4 or 5 years, I was completely outside of the creative world. I was just parking cars as a valet and hustling in various different ways to make my habit. But what did happen was I was asked after 10 days of sort of recuperating this beautiful little family's home on the actually in a place called Brooklyn, which is Brooklyn, outside of Amsterdam, with the windmill in the background. It was like, after coming from the streets of Detroit and Lower East Side of Manhattan back in the day, I was in this idyllic space. I was asked to write something in the guest book, and I wrote a poem, which the refrain was at the end of it. I was just talking about being born again in different ways. I just wrote, "I'm dangerous with love." And that went on to become the name of a documentary that Michelle Negroponte made about myself and my work. And I think what I was foreshadowing is, because I already had this sort of evangelical zeal to go and, let other people in my situation who were struggling, who maybe didn't have, the resources. And by the way, at that point, $2,000 was a lot of money for my family. People were struggling. They had to mortgage their home, actually. But for folks that didn't have that or couldn't leave the country, because, by the way, it's a Schedule I felony in the same category as heroin, ibogaine in the United States. So my idea almost immediately was to come and bring it to the United States and just do it. And so that's what it was, this sort of dangerous radical love. I think I was foreseeing my future.
And when you say do it, you mean start serving it to other heroin addicts? Yeah,
detoxing folks, which was quite a thing.
Mm-hmm. And I know I've seen the documentary, I'm Dangerous with Love. So I know that is in fact what happened. So how did you proceed from there? And you knew that it was a Schedule I drug. You knew that there were potential legal ramifications. How did you tackle this challenge? And did you struggle at any point with any part of that process?
Well, I was born into a tradition of a leftist tradition. My family, not just my parents, but my grandparents and great uncles were all, I'm not talking about liberals, I mean leftist. Some were communist, socialist, anarchist. I have a great uncle who died fighting in the Spanish Civil War. So on my dad's side, we're from an island that's pretty well. That's actually where I went afterwards. After Holland, I went to the island of Icaria. Some of you might know it as one of the blue zones, where the people live to 120. But they don't usually say in a lot of the literature on the blue zones, there's another color associated with that island, which is red. So it's known as the Red Island in Greece because of this sort of left view. So I came up in that, and it was very politicized very early on. So when I had gone through the process, I just knew what I was going to do. I didn't struggle with it. I had a vision. I'm going to start talking about crazy shit now, but I had visions for years of myself in handcuffs. And I had been in handcuffs many times, but it wasn't the vision that I was seeing. So in the Iboga, I knew everything was pretty much laid out for me. And I know this sounds crazy, but I knew what I was going to do. I knew very specific things. I knew I was going to be on, for example, I was going to be a guest or featured on This American Life. That happened within 3 years. There's no effort I could have done to do that, but that just sort of happened. I knew that there would be a movie. I knew that I would eventually be arrested. I knew that I would eventually go to Africa, and I knew to Gabon, and I knew who would initiate me into the Bwiti because I saw him, my vision. All of this sounds pretty crazy, but if I was to say anything else, I'd be lying. So I'm not going to lie to you. So yeah, I didn't struggle with it much. I mean, it caused, what I did was I went to Greece and I spent 3 months in the village, and the ancestral bit came in. It was sort of a flood, the ancestral piece. And I mean the piece, like I realized who I was and where I was from, and which is a very big part of Bwiti, which is the spirituality in Central Africa, in Gabon, that grows up around ibogaine. But it's also been described, iboga has been described as an epigenetic healer. And the idea in Bwiti and in many cultures, particularly African cultures, is that you heal yourself and you heal your ancestors. So I was healing those old lefties that had struggled in the Greek Civil War, that had been imprisoned and abused and had come as immigrants and had experienced immigration, in this country for Southern Europeans in the 100 years ago or 90 or 70 years ago. And it wasn't a nice, they were poor people. And those patterns that had continued, I saw them and healed them. And the whole time I was in the village, I was in my grandmother's village where my grandmother was born, and she was long dead at that point. But I was burning with this desire to come to the States. I should say there was a pivotal moment in that village. My Greek is not that good, but I was walking through the town, the little village, and there weren't a lot of folks there. It was mostly old people because other people were out making a living in the States or Athens or Germany or Australia, and they come back in the summer, And so there's a strange young man walking through the village, and he was just under 40 at that point. And this old lady came up to me, and she had my grandmother's walker. I used to call my grandmother, she had to call her walk the John Wayne walk. She would kind of like move, shift side to side, and the same sort of unsmiling stare, and she's sizing me up. And she asked me a question, which at first I thought was, "Who are you?" But I misinterpreted. What she was asking me is, whose was I? Who did I belong to? And once I understood that, and I told her the name of my family, my great grandfather, my grandmother, and she sized me up, placed me in her world, in her lineage. And before she left, she's told me that my grandmother had baptized her. And so I'm saying that because there was this great healing of healing that occurred not only with the medicine, but in that village, but also a building that I was going to come back and do this work as an act of radical service. And that's what I did. I mean, it took me a while to get back. And I got to say, don't try this at home. Iboga is serious medicine. Detox is someone who's serious. At first, I did it without medical, assistance, which for this particular drug, which is very high threshold, is dangerous. I was blessed that no one ended up dying, but that's the work I did. And I did it for many years, and I did it not underground. I was very vocal about it. I was on This American Life. I was talking at conferences. I would announce that I was going to go do it. There's newspaper articles about it and so forth. And a movie made about it.
Right. Yeah. Well, earlier you said that after your personal experience using ibogaine, that you came away with this evangelical zeal to share it with others. That was interesting for me to hear that, because going into it, it was something that was not meant to be so profound. It was kind of a stop on the way to Greece and not meant to change the course of your life at all. What was the turning point in your mindset there? Was it this revelation that you were doing ancestral karma healing for your family, or was it something that you saw in your visions? Like, what was it that made you change your mind about the significance?
The thing about it, not only was I going to Greece, I was going to die. That was my plan, was to die. I was done with this incarnation. I cannot pinpoint where it was, but the transformation was so, I don't know, for anyone who hasn't had a serious physical dependency on something, the transformation was so suddenly, so immediate, and without, there wasn't a point in the vision that said, no more heroin for you. Actually, the visions weren't about that at all. There was visions about sexual abuse as a kid. There was visions about my relationship with my father. There was visions about the death of my common law wife and the loss of my child. There was messages about the way I had treated people, the things that I had done. There was this sort of an accounting of all of that. And at the end of it, when I sort of crawled out of that cocoon of, really, I was vomiting, and things were coming out of every orifice. Basically, when I came out of that and sort of cleansed myself, there was just no question what I was going to do. There was no question that I was never going to use again, or at least so far I haven't. It's been 17 years. It just wasn't a question. My father, who is sort of a fundamentalist atheist, he saw this. He said, if this thing works for this guy, he's going to be a spokesman. I think he kind of saw my activist work, my work as a lead singer, and the way I could work with people. He saw something, but that was my atheist father saw the future. I didn't, and there was no moment. It was just, this is what I'm doing. And the visions of my, let's say, of my teacher in Gabon, that came to me. That was a vision. There was a man standing in the forest with his beard, and that was Papa Andre, who I met maybe 4 or 5 years later. But there was nothing in the vision that said, you will do this. It was just a knowing.
Right. Now we're talking about Dharma. This is your path, your purpose, and it's laid out for you, which takes away a lot of the fear and confusion to know at a deep level like that.
Right. And actually, what I thought of course, I guess your Dharma changes, right? Your Dharma is revealed if it doesn't change, because it is morphed into other things, because I thought it was to work with this plant, but it morphed as time went on. Mm-hmm. I think about this a lot. Clearly, it's sort of my work in the world. I'm sorry, my friend's got a cough. I don't know if that's coming through.
It's okay. Don't worry.
Yeah. But it's okay. You can cough. It's okay. We live in a world where people can cough. Anyways, but it's. So is it the work with drug users? And what I've come to, I did a talk at Three Jewels in New York with Hector. I don't know if you know Hector.
I do know Hector. He's also been on the podcast. Hector Marcel.
Yeah. Hector Marcel. What a beautiful human being. And we did talk on drugs and spirituality. And I'm also writing my memoirs right now. And so I'm really thinking about all of this. And is it about drugs? So what I've been talking about for years is sort of the biblical metaphor, the story of Christ healing the leper, right? So Christ, the leper is the outcast, the unhealable, the untouchable, the unlovable. Not only is he unhealable, untouchable, unlovable, he's dangerous to everybody else because they might get what he has, right? So no one talks to him, no one heals him. And so Christ touched him and healed him. Now, in a reductionist world, we might want to find the component that Christ molecule that we can sort of like synthesize and distribute, so there'll be no more leprosy, right? So that's a public health view, right? So there's a public health perspective on that. This also familial, it was great for the family, and it was great for the leper, right? But the bigger message there is about radical love and acceptance. He touched the untouchable. The embodiment of God on earth, of divine on earth, touched and loved the untouchable and the unlovable. And that's the bigger story, right? So, okay, so what does that mean? There's the personal, there's the sort of the metaphoric, we must love the unlovable, must find the love in ourselves. And then there is actually what that produces in the world. So if we were to love the leper, how does that change our heart? If we were to reach out and take a risk and touch the leper, how does that change us? So in the modern day, where we are right now is with the body, that's a politicized body. That leper is a politicized body in many ways, like the politicized body of the addict. So when we stretch ourselves, we change. And if we look to change, if we look to that change, where's that change leading us? That change is leading us not only to personal transformation and familial transformation and community transformation, that will lead to global and cosmic transformation. Because what we have to do and how we have to move through the world is so different so radically different in order for us to do that. I'm thinking about Theophilus, I can't think of his last name. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I believe he's Navajo. He's had a show on WBAI for years. I can't think of his last name, but he's an Indian activist. I had dinner with him. I don't know him well. I had dinner with him and several other people years ago. And he said there was, I think it's Hopi, a prophecy that said, let's just say Native American because I don't want to get the wrong nation, a Native American prophecy that said that in order for us, the Europeans, the ones who are sort of pulling the levers, in order for them to be okay for us, then we would have to make his people happy. It sounded like a really great thing, right? Okay, that's cool. I just finished the meal. And that just stuck with me for several days. What it really means is in order for end stage capitalism, for the power structure to make Native Americans happy, meaning give land, water, resources, give back, nurture, share, listen, all that stuff that would have to take place within the individuals, and then the structure would cause the revolution that would change, that would take us away from the brink of destruction. And so I fought. I did this radical service for years. I detoxed heroin addicts in hotel rooms and motel rooms. We'll get into all that. And it was important, I think, for the individuals. But I was also doing it to make iboga more acceptable in the United States, which I realize now is the smallest part of it.
Right. It's similar to the act of Christ touching the leper. It's not about what the actual mechanism of healing was, but it's more about the implication for what that means in the heart of the healer and the healed. And I think that's a message that's very important from what you're saying, that when we heal, it's not just a one-sided exchange.
It's not. And it always happens when we talk, someone asked about helping. The problem with helping, or even healing, I've been thinking about this lately too. I'm not even comfortable, I don't think, and this is like this week. I've been thinking about, I don't know, but I don't want to digress, but I'd like to get back to healing. But this idea of it being a one direction process is so damaging. There's so much to learn from the leper. There's so much to learn from somebody's process. So, I love that Buddhist idea that Hector talks about, as well as other Buddhists. And he talks about it so beautifully, that everyone is your teacher. Mm-hmm. And if you can go that way, instead of charity, you're going. There's an indigenous woman from Australia, an Aboriginal woman. I don't know her name, but I'm sure some of your listeners, or maybe you know the quote. And she says, if you're coming to help me, you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is tied up with my liberation, then let's dance together.
Nice.
And that's what it, that's right? And that's the process. And to just get to the healing bit, because I've always sort of shrunk away from the healer aspect. And when people call me a healer, it just seems like, first of all, it's a fucking lot of pressure. but like, there's also I had someone in one of our groups. I do a psychedelic disintegration group. I had someone say that, talk about, and we'll talk about this a little bit, like, sort of the shame that he felt at not getting the results, which I saw so much of in my work with ibogaine. For those folks who are seeking ibogaine and they came and they saw me on YouTube or on this show or that show, and they didn't have the same results, meaning that they went back and using heroin almost immediately or after weeks or months or whatever it was. And then there was this great deal of shame that somehow they let us down, that they let them, and my experience with this thing is it's not formulaic. So and I think the whole psychedelic movement and even yoga movement and that there is going to be this result by these series of things that you do. And clearly folks can't be at your level as a yogi, right? That's not going to happen it's certainly not going to happen for me. In this 57-year-old, beat up body, right? You know what I'm saying? But there was also a level of shame attached to it for a lot of folks. Mm-hmm. And and then this guy talked about that shame because he did MDMA to deal with this severe depression, and it's not going away. So something's really wrong with him. And then he talked a little bit about this idea of healing. And I also realized that, we're always going for healing. Sometimes there's no healing. Sometimes with someone with, we want MDMA and psilocybin to help with post-traumatic stress for our vets. I think maybe there's no healing from that in the way that we're thinking about getting over. I mean, maybe there's comfort. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's more of understanding, maybe. But I think all these things can be explored and shared. And I think that goes across all the sort of healing modalities and cultures, from Ayurvedic to shamanistic to allopathic. That this idea that there's something outside of you that's going to do this, and this is going to be the end result, and we're the ones that are going to deliver it. I don't see that.
That's a good point right there. And, maybe we're talking semantics here if we, pick over the words that we want to use. But I would say certainly there aren't absolute cures for any of these things. But is it, how do you feel about healing being an expression of love and potentially not taking us to a final destination or absolute resolution, but there being some sort of beauty in that process of being there together?
I think that's it, exactly. If we use the word healing, which I'm not sure if I'm going to use after next month, but I'm using it right now. If we use the word healing, then that's what it is. This exchange of love. And that's what we've gotten away from so much because what tends to happen is in specializing is hierarchy, and I think it's dangerous. And there's very few people that can walk it. Really, I mean, you take these sort of beautiful teachings like Buddhism or Christianity and the hierarchy that comes out of that is just kind of these messages of love, like, wow.
Yeah.
And the damage. Yeah. Because we want to heal someone. We want to save someone. We want them to be enlightened or saved or whatever the goal is, or, stop their incarnation and.
Yeah, it's difficult because, at the same time, as someone who has gone around and served ibogaine to many different people and seen all the different aftermath possibilities, like you do come with a level of authority, a level of credibility or expertise that is valuable. And, people look to you when you have experience as a guide, but that doesn't mean that you are the keeper of all that is true. And that's where it gets hairy, I think.
I think it's and that's exactly it. I mean, when you're a great yoga, I mean, look, it's ripe for abuse. When you're an incredible yogi, or you have some skill set in administering something or a particular spiritual path, it doesn't really necessarily sort of correspond to what we might call goodness. It's like the guy who can shoot a 3-pointer all day, and he gets sort of elevated in our culture. I mean, that's what he does. And I think it's really hard for folks. The other thing is people are looking for mom and dad. They're looking for that comfort in the teacher. They're looking for that comfort in the healer. They're looking for that comfort in the artist or the athlete. They're looking for that way through this very difficult path. And I think that we have to be very wary of it. There's a great anarchist philosopher and probably the first ecologist in modern times, I would say. His name is Murray Bookchin, and I would suggest that everyone check him out. But Murray Bookchin talks about, this idea in a lot of traditional societies, but I've never heard it sort of articulated like this, is that even what we call wisdom in some societies, but I think it's a sort of a good way to sort of walk through the world, it's basically just a job description. And that's it. So if you're wise about something in particular, that's your job and that's it. And we're not having this conversation right now without the producer that produced the show, without the people that, mind the cultic, God bless us, to have this talk. So there's There's a miner in our conversation. There's people in the factories who produce the earbuds. There's the guy who made me the coffee this morning, who without him I would not be having this talk. You know, there's all these people, and I think when you're an incredible yogi or a brilliant professor or a very good ceremonialist, there's a tendency for folks to want to sort of give up power because they just want someone else to drive. I understand it. And especially if it's exotic, like if someone's from India or Africa, or, you know, and it's like some white folks from North America, there's this other thing. We sort of want to, like, you know, make people somehow not people by making them specialer with an ER, which there's no word for it, but like, yeah, but making them more human, maybe, which takes them out of human, somehow wiser because of their tradition, you know. And so we're seeing all kinds of misunderstandings and abuses, and just very much human.
And in your arena, when you're talking about dealing with people who are suffering from addiction or prone to addiction, I mean, is there something to be said for that being a repeating pattern, you know, giving up your power to something outside of yourself that you believe will solve your problems?
Oh, sure. Or
seems parallel, right?
No, it is. And you see it. Look, it happened with me for a while, not so much giving up my power. I sort of fell into this thing. I'm really grateful to Iboga. I'm really grateful to Howard Lutzoff, who was the first to discover its therapeutic potential with addiction. And he became my friend and teacher. I'm grateful to the people of Gabon for the Bwiti, for their teachings. But I sort of gave up my power to this. I sort of fetishized the plant. And I gave up. I'm following the plant. You hear people talking about this. I'm following the plant path. I'm following the plant path. And what I saw is that I became addicted to being in this space as quote unquote healer. And I did it to the detriment of all, which you can see in that film. I'm fucking nuts in that film. I'm Dangerous with Love. Incidentally, it was started 15 years ago, and I've hopefully grown some since then. But I was so on fire with delivering this that I lost a certain power, that I just wanted so many people, and I just didn't give a shit. And I'm kind of grateful that the DEA stopped me, because it gave me time for reflection. But like, there is a danger for that. And you see people coming out of addiction and finding a guru and finding this or that. And yeah, there is a tendency for that. You know, I mean, one thing about 12 steps, and it's not for everybody. I'm in 12-step fellowship for sort of other than substance at this point, but it recognizes the tendency to sort of deify humans, and it's sort of in the 12 traditions, which is really sort of an anarcho document. It anticipates that tendency. What happens, though, is people deify the 12 steps and become sort of, in a healthy way for the most part, and I want to be very careful in saying this, but it becomes a pattern. I don't want to say addicted, but it becomes a pattern, and sometimes difficult to break out of.
Well, this is a nice segue to talk about what you're doing at the New York Harm Reduction Educators. Tell me about, first of all, define harm reduction, because I know that is a specific term that is used in a specific way. And then talk a little bit about how the work there is different from, say, a 12-step program and some of the other alternatives out there.
Right on. Well, harm reduction, the easiest, what they say, which is sort of formulaic, we meet people where they're at. Okay, so, which is easier said than done. What it is, it sort of came up out of the AIDS epidemic in the early 90s. And the idea is that we reduce the harm of drug use and sex work primarily. So in its most obvious form, its most street level form, it's needle exchange. That means, or syringe. God, I said needle exchange. Like I'm going back. People in harm reduction world would cringe at my vernacular. It's syringe access. So in other words, you give people clean syringes, which might seem obvious, or it might seem radical to some people listening, or it might seem obvious to other folks. I'll go back to Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, when I was using in the early 90s in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and all my friends were dying from HIV, this new thing that was spreading out, and the Democratic mayor and governor of the state, Cuomo, and oh God, I mercifully forgot his name, Koch, had put a ban on access to clean syringes. There was no place to buy a syringe, and legally. So I would go to 2nd Street and Avenue A, which was B actually, which was a very different 2nd Street and Avenue B than it is today. And there was a couple spots there that guys and girls would be standing on the corner selling these syringes for $1 or $2. And sometimes I'd open up a sealed, quote unquote, sealed syringe, and I'd squeeze it, and a little water would come out of the top, meaning that it had been used before. And I would still use it because of my desperation.
Right.
And putting myself at risk for hepatitis C and HIV over and over again. So one day I walked up on that corner, and there were some other people there. I had set up a table, and there are people from this organization called ACT UP. And for those of you who don't know who ACT UP is, you should be Googling that right now. They were a bunch of activists, very militant activists that were demanding, most of them identified as queer, demanding that the government do something, that they push HIV medication through, that they pay attention. And the president at that point hadn't even said the word yet, hadn't said AIDS yet, that they pay attention that this was happening to queer people and drug users, and primarily women of color. That was the people who were most affected, and still are. And so these people were set up on the street, and they were giving away syringes, clean syringes, for free. And they were risking jail. And every time I talk about that, it moves me. And that was probably over 20 years ago. It moves me because here was, just like touching the leopard, someone went out, risked their freedom, and touched me. And they said, look, we know what you're doing. We're not here to judge you. If you want to stop, we'll talk to you about that. But, we know you need this right now. And here's the syringe. And to me, it was this transformational moment in my life that someone cared about me at that point. And so the harm reduction movement came out of that sort of radical service and defiance of the law, but saying, like, look, we're going to do this. And what happened was governments started to pay attention, because it was clear that it was going to cost them a lot of money if these users, these drug users, were going to continue to get infected with HIV and hepatitis C. And at that point, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was an incredibly high percentage of people injecting were going to get HIV and hepatitis C, or HIV for sure. I mean, I think it was like, I don't know if it was 2 in 10 or some crazy number. And now it's down to something like 1% or less than 1% of new infections of people who inject drugs. And that is because of this work. And it's because it became policy. Everyone except the last one in the country was fucking Pence in Indiana. He as governor, he banned syringe exchange up until maybe 5 years ago. But even he relented, and so this has become policy around the world. These syringe exchange, and these the places that give out syringes, mostly in urban areas, there's also all these other services that have been provided for, like, maybe there's a doctor that comes through, there's case management, some mental health work. Anyways, I was for many years a client of a syringe exchange program, a harm reduction center. What happened over time is that we won on the science, and then the science won over on us, meaning that it became just about reducing the risk of hepatitis C and HIV and overdose. And the little things that used to happen in the early days, like closing shop for an afternoon and just doing people's hair, which I thought was beautiful back in the 90s, where they would just, guys and girls, people who are hairstylists and so forth, would come in, and anybody, man or woman or however they identified, could come in and just do hair and makeup. That doesn't have a science component. So all that sort of faded away. So anyway, let me fast forward to like how I got into work. The idea in harm reduction, well, let me get into that, is that we meet people where they're at. We don't go in with any judgment. We don't go in and say, we're not there to say, look, here's a needle, but you really need to stop dope. We're going to give you quote unquote tough love. Clearly that doesn't work. If it worked, there'd be no one using drugs right now. People say, well, aren't you like, just enabling folks? I work in East Harlem. This is not a population. This is black and brown and poor people and some white poor people, most of them homeless, most of them been formerly incarcerated. They're not a group of people that are suffering from coddling. They have faced it's not the problem here that their actions don't have some sort of a counterweight. As a matter of fact, what's happened is they've been so criminalized that maybe their actions, good or bad, as we would see it, don't matter because they've been sort of criminalized for being. Anyways, the idea is that we just accept you wherever you're at. And if you're going to go get high, we're going to want to make sure that you're okay at that point. If you want to stop, we'll talk about that. We'll look at you. And we just want to look at the full person. Now, that sounds like it's a great thing to say, but to me, it is so close to a Buddhist Dharma. Because what I ask of myself, and this is a spiritual practice for me, is when I go in to work, is that I have to try not to hope for an outcome. And much like counting your breath, you're going to veer off. Much like a practicing Hindu or a practicing Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or whatever, a Muslim or whatever, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to teach Christ, to walk in Christ's path all the time. So in other words, I go in every day. My job is to be there for folks. And I'll get into more specific about the work we're doing there at NYRE, New York Harm Reduction Educators. But my job is, first and foremost, is to be in acceptance. But there are many, many times where I want someone just to fucking stop with the dope. Don't go back to that destructive relationship. Please don't go on that corner and sell yourself because I love you. And I don't want to see you die. And coming from that point of that's somewhere in me, and often that will lead me to say or do things that lead me off the track, that put me in judgment and tell someone what is right, something prescriptive. Sometimes there's a place for a prescriptive when somebody asks, but I never, or I try never. I fail, and sometimes I judge, and sometimes I want things to be different. But the idea is to go back to this radical love and acceptance. That is not to say that we don't follow the normal protocol, normal interactions that sort of the civil interactions that sort of govern our way of being in the world. I mean, if someone's rude, if someone is violent, we don't tolerate that. But we're not going to judge someone simply by what they put into their body. So that's the practice. That's the spiritual practice of harm reduction. What we do, and God bless you because you've come up and done work up at NYRE. We have a little component called the holistic component that I think is unique in all harm reduction, maybe in the world. Well, let me just say the way that I got to NYRE is that I was arrested by the DEA for doing ceremony, a bogus ceremony, which with no sense of irony. Apparently the DEA didn't think it was ironic or didn't comment on that I was detoxing a heroin addict when I was arrested. It was a sting operation.
Now, for them, it's drugs are drugs. All drugs are
drugs. So, anyways, I was facing a lot of time, and they had taken. And this is after I went to Gabon and was initiated as a healer within the tradition of Bwiti, and I've been back several times, and it was my religion, and went through a whole court case. But as that case was coming up, God, or however the listener wants to, however that word is translated, opened up this new door for me, which was working with my at that point, he's no longer working there, but the great Brian Murphy, who does great work with people post psychedelics now, but they've been working in harm reduction as a therapist. We and my colleague Juan Cortez, we began to just sort of organically. I got arrested. DEA took my magic powder away. I had all this ritual and all this kind of stuff. And what the hell was I going to do? I waited to, at that point, go to prison. It looked like I was going to go to prison for this. And this opportunity to come in and just sort of start to work at New York Harm Reduction Educators in East Harlem. And we started out, there was a meditation group that Brian was doing, and he was just sort of sitting there quietly meditating. And I brought in a rattle one day, and then I brought in some more rattles for people to sort of shake during the meditation. And then I heard someone play drums. So then someone started playing drums. And before too long, there was this sort of wild celebration every Thursday, which we somehow called We Are the Medicine. And this celebration has gone on for 8 years. And there's been a ritual that has been just morphing with no guidance. Every Thursday, we have this beautiful drum circle where ritual is performed and new ritual comes in and new songs are created. And so that's part of the sort of the core, or I guess maybe the anchor to the holistic program. And through time, through no design and no money, other healers and practitioners started to come. Now, Juan Cortez was there doing auricular acupuncture. That's the 5-point acupuncture on the ear. And that's been part of harm reduction. And we inherited that from the work of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. And people should look into that Young Lord Party, which was sort of the sister organization of the Black Panther for Puerto Rican people in this neighborhood in East Harlem. Anyways, we were doing auricular acupuncture, but more healers started to come in. And what's happened, again, with no design and no money, was working with Rose Aaron and working with 3 Jewels and working with all these other great organizations. We provide acupressure, full body and auricular acupuncture. We provide sound meditations. We provide yoga, breath work, trips out to the forest just to walk in the woods in New Jersey. And the list goes on and on for active drug users, homeless folks who are formerly incarcerated, sex workers, people who don't have access to what we know works for us, the people listening, and we offer it for free to anyone who comes through the door. And what's happened, and that work has been without the magic powder, without the psychedelics, and I still do work with psychedelics, that work has been some of the most powerful work I've ever done. And let me say this, in sort of talking about that healer-healed relationship, that sort of hierarchical helper relationship. What happens in that We Are the Medicine circle is that everyone participates. Everyone gives. Everyone shakes a rattle. People dance. Everyone talks from their heart about what they're going through. They might set up the altar. The altar changes as people bring altars and bring objects. Everyone gives. And what we get to do, what you and I get to do, my friend, is we get to be in contribution. That's what you're a teacher, you're a body worker, you have this podcast, you go around the world, you know what that gives you. I get to give. And there's so little, there's precious little opportunity for people to give. We have been reduced to consumers. If we want to look at the so-called opioid epidemic, it's really an overdose epidemic, but the use of these drugs, the rising death rate of white men between 22 and 40 for the first time ever, the only rising death rate that has been recorded in decades, from liver disease, from overdose, and from suicide. If we want to look at all this stuff, the mass shootings, I think, and I don't want to be simplistic because I think it's as complicated as humanity. But I know that when I wasn't able to give, that's when I felt deprived. That when I became a consumer and not a contributor, that's when I felt cut off. And I see it every day in our drop-in center where you see really poor people, some people really strung out, really struggling, wanting to give. Yeah, they might take your wallet if you leave it out. That's on you, but they might share the context of that wallet with their brothers and sisters. So that's the thing. And that's the world that, and I would say for any practitioner out there, that's the thing to look for. How can the people that you're working with, that you're co-creating space with, how can they give and how can they be part of the process?
Yes, absolutely. That is it. And I think all of the listeners, there are a lot of yoga teachers who listen to Dharma Talk, and they're all nodding their heads right now, because that's what it's about when you teach yoga too. It's like what you get from giving. And it doesn't need to be a selfish or selfless thing. It's like what we talked about before. The reason why you shy away from words like help and heal is because it makes it seem like there's a savior and a recipient, when really everybody is both.
Right on. And there's a way in for everybody.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, I know you've got another project that you've been doing recently, the Psychedelic Disintegration sessions. What's that all about? You talked about plant teachers earlier. What's going on with the psychedelic disintegrations?
Well, so I still work with psychedelic medicine outside of the country. I do work with MDMA and psilocybin and sound, and we're seeing this sort of resurgence of psychedelic medicine and a greater acceptance. And my colleague Brian Murphy, who has a wonderful website, After the Medicine, and he's not only done work in harm reduction, but he's been sort of an OG in the psychedelic therapy. He's a therapist, psychotherapist. He was encouraging. He said, "Let's do a group. Let's do a group in the psychedelic integration group." And there's a lot of talk about integration. And I said, the only way I'm going to do it is we call it disintegration. Partly because I'm just a contrarian fuck, but also the idea of sort of integrating, and we use the beautiful Krishnamurti. I'm gonna probably not say it exactly, but I think it's something like I'm gonna fuck it up here. Hold on. Sort of like being able to participate in a sick society is no sign of health.
I see. Yeah.
And so the idea that, much like harm reduction, we were just going out there to say, look, we're going to reduce HIV, AIDS, and then it just became all about that instead of giving people like a makeover, like giving homeless people
once
a
it
makeover.
Became like, once it worked into the system and into the policies, it kind of lost the heart of it.
It loses the heart. It loses the heart of it. And like, if you look at the way the psychedelic movement, with really good organizations, I think for the most part, are really appealing. They say, look, we end PTSD, which I think is just skewed and nonsense if you do MDMA, and, we'll just get you back in. It's sort of the way that cognitive therapy was pushed after the Second World War. You have all these damaged guys, we could just go sit around and be like this guy, crazy guy Jung, and talk about archetypes and spirit and all this stuff, or we can just give them 12 cognitive therapy sessions and boom, they're back at work. And that's what they're trying to kind of say is like, we can't just get it will interrupt the process with a medicine. And going back to this sort of consumer contributor type of thing, the idea of the way it's been reduced in the psychedelic movement and trying to legitimize stuff is that you can take something to heal you from the effects of materialism. It's kind of crazy. It's fucking batshit nuts. So, and there's also the reason I became interested is there's no space to talk about that really, even in the traditional psychedelic spaces. They're all about integrating this back in. I don't know how you integrate an ayahuasca ceremony back into working at Discount Shoe Warehouse. I mean, what does that have other than maybe the way you work with people, maybe there's things that are not integratable into the existing paradigm. Maybe there's a way that we can disintegrate boundaries, disintegrate stuff that is no longer useful to us, and also have a space to talk about when psychedelics don't work. Like that guy was talking about when they went for the Holy Grail and it didn't work. But what we hear people talking about in the disintegration group is it's not necessarily the compounds, because I'm not interested in compounds. They're talking about the process to what they had to do for themselves. Real rationalists having to go to some crazy self-proclaimed shaman in Brooklyn, and just the process of going through that, right? Most of the spiritual classics are about journeys. They're not about being at the space. Bhagavad Gita is about a journey. The Bible is about a journey. The Quran is about a journey. The Buddha was on a journey until he found that tree. And then he went on. He went walking, right? So what is the journey there? And what do we find with each other? So the Disintegration is a place to come in. We do it every Tuesday night in Chelsea. You can go to my website and check it out. It's a place to discuss that. Also a place to discuss for folks who didn't find a great trip. There's also this idea in the psychedelic world, which they're mimicking the outer world where there's no such thing as a bad trip. I'll have to tell you that there absolutely is. And we can gaslight people about their experiences within psychedelics. And so it's a really smart conversation. It's a heart-opening conversation. And we want to sort of expand on that ethos of disintegrating the things that are no longer useful for us and not having to be part of a narrative of like the plant teacher or the holy shaman or just a really smart, heartfelt conversation we've been having.
I dig it. Sounds good.
Yeah,
and for people in the area who might want to stop through and participate in that conversation, how do they do that?
You can go to my website, dimitrimugianis.com, and you can book a space. There's also, do I have the address here somewhere? It's on 23rd Street every Tuesday at 7:00. I'm trying to find the address and I can't. But it's on my website, 7:00 Tuesdays on 23rd Street in Chelsea. It's $30. I'll be doing some more talks with other psychedelic groups and exploring this opening. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think what we're doing is we're trying to. I don't think we can. Well, I'll just say this. Leonard Cohen said they sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, Dimitri, I think we better start wrapping this up, but we always finish these interviews with a round of rapid fire questions. We didn't talk too much about yoga, although there were a lot of ideas in here that fit right in line with the spirit of yoga. But do you practice yoga? I have had a practice, and I'm going to start again, I swear. But when I have had it, when I've been in a regular practice, it's been amazing. It's been really helpful for me. Yeah. Then you've got enough background to be able to answer this rapid fire round of questions then. I don't think so, but go ahead. All right, here we go. This is the Prana Round. Answer in minimum 1 word, maximum 1 sentence. Okay. In 1 word, why do you practice yoga? Peace. What is your favorite yoga pose and why? I like to sleep. So Yoga Nidra? Savasana? Savasana. Look, I was a junkie for 20 years. Okay. Savasana. All right. What is the single best cue or piece of advice that you've ever received from a teacher? And this one does not need to be a yoga teacher. Well, listen to your body. Recommend 1 book, modern or ancient, for our listeners. Oh, wow. I'm drawing a blank, but give me a second. Nothing's jumping out right now because there's so many books. You know what? I'd read the book of your tradition. Okay. The one you were born into. The one you were born into. Get in touch with your ancestry. Mm-hmm. Okay. Is yoga for everyone? In my understanding, yes. I mean, we have people doing yoga in chairs at Nairi who sometimes can barely stand up or walk. So yes. Awesome. Okay, last question. Dimitri, how can our audience get in touch with you and how can we support you in your Dharma? Thank you. You can get in touch with me at dimitrimugianis.com. I will talk to anyone for 15 minutes for free. So if you want to talk to me, then that can be arranged. And just write to me. You can give money to Nairi. The thing is it probably won't go directly to the holistic. So if you're interested in donating, contributing, either as a volunteer, if you have a skill set that you want to bring up to the folks of East Harlem and the South Bronx, please do so. Or if you want to give a donation, check with me at my website, dimitrimugianis.com, so I make sure that it gets to our holistic component and not to like buying a new file cabinet.
which is important, but let them get that somewhere else. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for your transparency on that. And thank you for your transparency with your personal story today. It's been really cool to hear from you and have this conversation. We haven't gone, this far in your background in person. So it's really been my privilege, and I'm happy to share it with others.
Thank you so much, brother. It's been a privilege, and it's all due to my teachers, young, old, four-legged, two-legged, winged, and leafed.
Amazing. I love it. All right, Dimitri. Well, I'll see you soon at the Harm Reduction Center, and hopefully you'll be meeting some new faces from the Dharma Talk community too.
Yes. God bless. Thanks, brother.
Dharma Talkers, I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. And if you did, please share it. Take a screenshot, share it on Instagram, and tag me at Henry Wins. I love hearing from you about the conversations that make an impact for you. We have the ability to shape the world through our thoughts, words, and conversation. So let's influence the collective consciousness together. All my gratitude to Rory Wagstaff of Ease of Mind Productions for keeping our audio crisp and operations smooth, and to Patrick Kiebzak of Momentology Music and Art for supplying the powerful soundtrack to these conversations. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review, and tune in to new episodes of Dharma Talk every Thursday. I'll speak to you next week, and until then, keep living your Dharma.